This is a FarmDoc Daily webinar on University of Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason. Today, the yield trap. We'll talk with Laura Gentry and Sarah Sellars about the yield trap and what that means. Sarah Sellars joins us to begin with. She is in South Dakota at South Dakota State University Extension. Hi, Sarah. It's so good to see you again after spending a few years here on campus at the University of Illinois. By the way, can you give us just a little bit about your background, please?
Sure. It's great to be here, Todd, virtually back in Illinois for this webinar, and great to talk with you and Laura and Jim again. So I grew up in a grain and livestock farm in West Central Illinois, and I did my bachelor's and my PhD at University of Illinois. So when I was a PhD student, I was working with Dr. Gary Schnitke and Dr. Laura Gentry, working with the PCM data, trying to answer some really applied research questions and write some papers that our farmers would find beneficial to help them when they're making decisions. So after graduation, about a year and a half ago, I moved up here to South Dakota, and now I'm assistant professor and extension specialist up here at South Dakota State University.
And you're still working with some of the PCM data. The floor is yours to take us through the first set of slides, please.
Thank you, Todd. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started here. A lot of people probably know right now we're facing some challenging economic times for farmers caused by lower commodity prices and higher input prices, putting margins into a tighter pinch, and with people looking ways to reduce costs and increase profitability for the upcoming year. So we're facing our lowest income years since the year 2000. Corn and soybean prices have come down from some of the higher prices we saw throughout 2021 and 2022. When I look at the WASDE price projections for the next year, I don't see a lot of indication that they would go up unless there's some sort of supply or demand shock in the market. So we would expect this period of tighter margins to continue in the medium term. Another problem is that we also faced a period of higher costs in 2021 and 2022, but at that time we had higher commodity prices, so margins weren't as tight, but now we're in a higher cost environment and a lower price environment, so this is putting farmers more in a pinch than what we've seen in previous years. We've seen increases in fertilizer costs, interest rates, and some of our other inputs compared to some of the historical costs we've seen. And if we want to see a profit without some sort of government intervention, like the ad hoc federal payments we've been seeing, the cost side of this equation is going to have to come down within this low price environment. So we're going to talk through that and talk about some ways that you can think about that. So what I want to mention is how we think about the profitability versus yield maximization. So historically, farmers have been thinking about, okay, how do I maximize my yield? How do I get the highest yields possible? What we want to do is shift that mindset to getting the idea of the highest returns possible, because we know that higher yields do not always equal to higher returns. So that's what I'm trying to demonstrate there, the picture on the left. This shows the idea of diminishing marginal returns. So we know with most inputs we use in crop production, they reach a point of diminishing marginal returns. This is the point where if we apply one more unit of fertilizer or another 1,000 seeds, the additional yield gain we get from that application does not pay for itself. So then we're actually reducing our profit. So what we want to do is we want to find that economically optimal return, that peak of that curve, and we want to select that input rate. The relationship between inputs and yield is not a straight line. If it were, we could apply infinite inputs and get infinite yield, and that would be really nice. But unfortunately, most of our inputs look like a curve, like the one I'm showing. The one I'm showing is looking at fertilizer and soil nitrogen testing and return to nitrogen. It demonstrates that eventually we reach that peak, and then we see a period of diminishing marginal return. So we want to apply at the start level. And again, this is from South Dakota, so this is using South Dakota data, but we have a lot of this great data in Illinois too. So the idea here is shifting the farmer mindset from yield maximization to profit maximization. Now I'll turn it over to Laura to talk a little bit about what we see in the PCM data.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. So I just wanted to take a moment to demonstrate just what Sarah's talking about here. Within our own PCM data set, we have many examples of times when we can see these diminishing returns. One of the clearest examples, and the one I'm using here, is with nitrogen rates and also with nitrogen timing, but this applies to all different types of inputs. It applies to power costs associated with tillage, and I'll show that here a little bit later as well. But looking at these examples that you see right here, in this top graph right here on the left, we're looking at low SPR soils, so lower soil productivity ratings, so lower producing soils. This is for corn production. We see our nitrogen rate buckets that we have, that we use in PCM. This is in pounds per acre, so it ranges from less than 150 pounds per acre up to more than 225 pounds. The number of fields in each one of those buckets, the average corn yield for that nitrogen rate range, and then our operator and land return. Also, just for fun, I threw in the greenhouse gas emissions that are modeled to come out at each of those different rate ranges as well. We're not going to talk about that though. So the operator and land returns here are what we're really interested in. And so the yields, though, are what we're talking about with diminishing returns. We see that with more nitrogen, we don't see diminishing returns through this rate range. We actually just keep on increasing our as our nitrogen rate increases, our yields just continue to increase here. That's what we would expect. But we don't see the same thing for operator and land return, which is just what Sarah was showing. There's this point of diminishing returns after which you're putting on more nitrogen and you're not producing enough yield to cover those additional nitrogen application pounds that you're putting on. Here in this particular example that I'm showing with low SPR, this is happening right around 176 to 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. We see a very similar story for our high SPR. This is set up exactly the same way. It's just this is corn on our higher productivity soils. We see, again, different numbers, but the yields just continue to climb with higher nitrogen application through the 225 pound per acre rate range. But we start to see a tapering off of our net returns. Again, it's in this 176 to 200 pound per acre rate range is where we maximize our profitability. Beyond that, we're applying more nitrogen. We are getting higher yields, but it's not paying for itself. Over here in this larger table, this is just expanded to show some more of our cost elements in our table here. But this is, again, nitrogen applications. This is, in this example, it's high SPR soils, corn production. All of our years average 2015 through 2023. We're still working on our 24 data set. And we're looking at different nitrogen application timing. So the first category here is when more than 40% of the total nitrogen rate is applied in the fall. Over here, the next one over is when most of the nitrogen is applied pre-plant. So that would be just before planting or at planting. This includes at planting nitrogen applications. This next category is mostly side dress. Most of the nitrogen is applied side dress. 50-50 means that it's almost all applied, almost all of the nitrogen is applied in season, and about half is applied pre-plant and about half is applied side dress. And then this last category is, we call it the three-way split. That means something less than 40% of nitrogen was applied in the fall, and then the balance of it was applied pre-plant and side dress. So this also shows the nitrogen use efficiency in pounds of nitrogen per bushel of grain in each one of these timing classes, the number of fields in each timing class. Here's our yields. Our yields in each one of these timing classes. You can see that the maximum yield here, this is, I think, really interesting. The maximum yield is this three-way split. The lowest yield is 220 bushels per acre. But when you go all the way down here to operator and land return, that's actually the highest operator and land return class. So it's absolutely true what Sarah's saying. We cannot just think of high yields anymore. That's an easy talking point. Farmers can talk about that easily. That's, I think, a lot of times why we emphasize this, is that people don't want to talk about their profitability in the coffee shop or to the guy ringing you up in the gas station, but it's easy to talk about yields. So we need to be thinking, though, as we're making management decisions about profitability. Okay, Sarah, I'm going to turn this back over to you now.
All righty, thank you, Laura. So during this period of higher input costs and lower prices, it's crucial to reduce costs to remain profitable. So we're going to talk about some of our research studies and PCM data and provide ways to help you do that and help you think about that for the upcoming year. So during this webinar, I'm going to talk about 3 studies that we did as part of my dissertation. They're all very applied, very real-world studies with questions that are designed to help farmers maximize profit. I'm going to skip the statistics and focus solely on the results, but if you want more information, I'm happy to send you any of the 3 papers. We can dive more into that if you want. Happy to talk with you about that. But for today, I'm going to keep it mostly just focus on the data and the results and skip all the statistical analysis. So the first paper, what we really wanted to answer was a really nice practical research question about if farmers who use the MRTN have higher profits. And also, we wanted to know what nitrogen timing results in the highest yield and returns for our PCM farmers. I also want to mention that the data I'm using for these 3 studies is through 2022, but we have, as Laura mentioned, they have data through 2023, and Laura's data is updated data, so she's showing what you're finding in the data through 2023. Another thing I want you to keep in mind is that 68% of the fields in our data set receive a nitrogen application above the MRTN profitable range, and we'll get into that a little more. So our main takeaways from our MRTN and nitrogen timing study is we find that the fields that receive an application of nitrogen above the MRTN profitable range, it does increase their yield, but it does not increase the returns on that field compared to those fields that are applying at the MRTN profitable range. We also find that 50% pre-plant, 50% post-plant nitrogen applications had higher yields, but we did not find any statistical difference in returns between any of the nitrogen timings in this study. So although it may seem like fall is the most cost-effective, when we look at the trends of nitrogen price, this isn't the case. This isn't what we find in the data set. So if we're applying fall nitrogen when nitrogen is theoretically cheapest, but we're losing some of that nitrogen and we're also having to pay for an inhibitor, what we're actually finding is that it's no more profitable than applying nitrogen in the spring. So farmers could shift their nitrogen away from fall nitrogen to some sort of spring application and maintain the same level of profitability as with fall nitrogen. So those were our main takeaways from that study. So doing that study led to our next question. So if farmers who are applying at the MRTN are more profitable than farmers who are applying below the MRTN, why are farmers not adopting the MRTN? And remember that the MRTN is the maximum return to nitrogen recommendation. That's going to differ from year to year depending on the nitrogen cost and price ratio. So for this study, we wanted to really dive into what are the observed factors associated with the adoption of the MRTN in Illinois. Could we figure out what would make a farmer more or less likely to use the MRTN? Now, it's important to remember that we're not able to say what causes our farmers to use the MRTN. We're just looking at factors associated with the adoption of the MRTN. And our results from this study suggest that we need to reach out to farmers who we think are using the MRTN but are actually not. So there's some farmers who may fit this characteristics that we find that may be more likely to use the MRTN, but they're not. So reaching out to those farmers could help them save money by lowering their nitrogen rates and also help Illinois as well. And again, I just want to mention, these are the range of applications we see in our data. So you can see that most of the fields in the data set are receiving an application above the MRTN recommended range. 26% of the fields are receiving an application at the MRTN, and 6% of our fields are receiving an application below the MRTN. So you can see there's quite a bit of people who are applying above the MRTN, and that does vary quite a bit, the total distribution of all the nitrogen rates that we see in the data. So our main findings from this MRTN adoption study are that using cover crops, enrollment in an NRCS program, and the use of strip till or no-till are the characteristics associated with farmers who are more likely to use the MRTN. The only significant factor we found associated with farmers who are less likely to adopt the MRTN are those farmers who are having any of their nitrogen custom applied by an ag retailer. So if they're having someone else do their application for them, it decreases the likelihood of adopting the MRTN, which I think is a really interesting finding. So I think one of the takeaways we should remember from this study is that it's important for you to review the latest nitrogen recommendations, review the MRTN, and if you're having an ag retailer or someone else custom apply your nitrogen for you, to be actively involved in making that decision and going over that information with them to make sure that you're getting the most for your money when you're selecting your nitrogen rate and maximizing your profitability when you're thinking about this input. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Laura to talk about what we've been seeing in the PCM data for MRTNs and profitability.
Thank you, Sarah. Hey, Sarah, we have one question that's related to this, so I'm just going to ask you now. What's the average additional nitrogen added above MRTN? In your data set you showed above MRTN, where does that start and stop?
I have to pull back up I have that in the paper. I don't know off the top of my head, but that distribution is pretty wide. A lot of people are in the data set are applying maybe 20 to 40 pounds above the MRTN profitable range. But we do see some outliers. We see some people applying 300 pounds or more of nitrogen as well. Not as many, but we do see some variability in the rates we see in the data set.
And I know the answer to this, but I'll ask you anyway. Do the applications include manure nitrogen? Or I think I know the answer. I think the answer is no, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah. So I forgot to mention that part. When we do the study, we clean the data. So we filter out the manure fields as part of that study, since that adds a different kind of variable in that we can't exactly control for. So we're focused only on the conventional corn within a certain bushel range and within a certain cost range. So we're factoring out some of those outliers or some of these different types of production, like we don't use organic production, we don't use any of the manured fields. So for all of our studies, we're just talking about conventional and non-organic and non-manured. So that's a good question.
And the data set, the data that I'm showing here, same rules. We have no manured fields in there, and it does not include any organic fields. And we do have some organic fields in the PCM program. So we pull those out for this analysis, though. Okay, so, well, what you're looking at here is an assessment, sort of a proofing of the MRTN using PCM data. And this is, I think, really, really interesting. So the MRTN, the maximum return to nitrogen, first of all, it's used in 7 different states, and it started in Iowa and Illinois. I think we have the most extensive data sets in those states, and it is an economic model. It's not an agronomic model. It was never designed to maximize productivity, yields. It was always meant to maximize profitability. That's the return part, maximum return to nitrogen. And it was designed to do that, and this would demonstrate that it does that well. And so what we do, of course, it being an economic model, it doesn't include any kind of a assessment of yields or the farmer making, a yield guess essentially for their fields. What it is taking in whether it's corn following soybean or corn following corn, which part of the state of Illinois you're located in, and then you put in your expectation for grain price and for your nitrogen fertilizer price. And that's what it's based on, that corn grain price to nitrogen fertilizer price ratio. And you can make it a little more complicated than that too, if you wanted to, for anyone who's not familiar with how that works. So we have data showing here the years 2016 through 2023, the prediction of the MRTN, the actual rate itself, and then there's also a range that the MRTN provides. And the values that we're using here are numbers that Dr. Gary Schnittke provided, and that nitrogen fertilizer, the corn grain to nitrogen fertilizer price, are representative of each of these individual years. So this for 2016, the MRTN predicted 168 pounds of nitrogen per acre would be the maximum return to nitrogen fertilizer, and the range was this 154 to 184 pounds of nitrogen per acre range. And then I brought in, looking at it as a retrospective, we came back, of course, later and looked at the 2016 year and said, what was the most profitable nitrogen fertilizer range and rate, and to test to see how good it was. And that's what you see here is we use those buckets. So the most profitable nitrogen fertilizer rate range in 2016, well, there were actually two that tied. It was 151 to 175 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and 176 to 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre were both the highest, and that was return, that average return was $279 per acre, as you see here. So how did that do in terms of a prediction with our MRTN? The MRTN did predict it in 2016. It did predict the most profitable nitrogen fertilizer range. So I circled that year. All right, what about 2017? In 2017, the MRTN prediction based on nitrogen grain prices corn grain prices and nitrogen fertilizer prices would have been 172 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and the range was 158 to 189. In that year, we found that actually the most profitable nitrogen fertilizer rate was for farmers who were applying less than 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. The actual, the average value was 131 pounds of nitrogen per acre. 2017 was a very productive growing season, and it had a lot of nitrogen mineralization potential. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that these values are for central Illinois, what you're looking at here, and it's for corn following soybean. So in central Illinois in 2017, we just didn't need as much nitrogen as the MRTN predicted. So I'm not going to circle 2017. In 2018, the MRTN value was 176 pounds of nitrogen, and the range was 161 to 193 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and the most profitable nitrogen rate range was the 151 to 175 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And that was for the actual value itself was 168 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Profitability was $377 per acre. And the MRTN nailed it. So we're going to circle that one. Very good value there. And it accurately predicted what the right rate range was. In 2019, it predicted 173 pounds, and the range was 158 to 189. And again, the most profitable range for high productivity fields in central Illinois was this 151 to 175 pounds of nitrogen. The actual value was 167, since 167 falls in that range, I circled it. So did a great job again that year. 2020, the value was 184. The MRTN nitrogen rate range was 169 to 200. And the actual value was, again, in the 151 to 175 pounds per acre. The actual value was 165. That's so close to the 169 that it predicted. And I mean, there is slop in our values here. Of course, there is this value, 165. There's numbers on either side of that. I think that that's good enough to say that 2020 did a good job of estimating that. So I circled it in yellow. 2021 was another one of those years that was a good growing season for farmers. Good yields, very good prices, high nitrogen prices, but also high corn prices, as you'll recall. And the most profitable range for the MRTN was 179 to 210 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And it only required about 100. That was a really interesting year. Our most profitable farmers that year, because of the prices, only applied 116 pounds of nitrogen per acre on average. So that was a different kind of year, very profitable year, and a good mineralization year. Farmers got a lot of nitrogen mineralization from their fields. So those farmers who we would often think underapplied their nitrogen in that year were the ones who really laughed all the way to the bank that year. So we won't circle it though. In 2022, it was the MRTN range was 155 to 176 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And the PCM most profitable range was the 155 to 175. The actual value was 163. The MRTN got it correct. And in 2023, that was the MRTN range was 171 pounds of nitrogen to 194 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And that was one of those years, again, we had high prices and good mineralization. Farmers who applied less nitrogen, around 133 pounds of nitrogen per acre, were the most profitable. So we won't circle that one. But the point here is that the MRTN gets it just right, or essentially just right, in 5 out of 8 years. And those 3 remaining years, it overestimated the nitrogen application, most profitable nitrogen application range. What farmers often criticize the MRTN recommendation is because they think it's too low, as evidenced by the fact that almost 70% of our farmers are applying above that MRTN range. But in fact, what this shows us is that when the MRTN doesn't get it exactly right, it's because it is being conservative, which is exactly what Dr. Emerson Nafziger has been telling us all these years, is that it is a conservative estimate for the most profitable rate range. So farmers should feel confident that they're not under applying nitrogen fertilizer using the MRTN. So again, just to remind you, probably for the 3rd time now, the PCM data demonstrates that 68% of farmers are applying above that MRTN range. A few other pieces here to this. Again, this piece about the timing of nitrogen fertilizer. It's because, again, nitrogen fertilizer is such an obvious place. It's to save money in times of low economic returns. When we have tight margins, looking at getting your nitrogen fertilizer rate right should be the very first thing that our farmers are doing, is what the PCM data is showing us. But what about the timing piece of all this? What this would demonstrate is that when we look at our whole data set here, this is all of our fields for our high SPR corn fields. We see that the most profitable over all years is the more in-season nitrogen timing, which is what Sarah was telling us. Those are the most profitable, but there's a little nuance to this. So what we see is that in these years that are the most profitable, we see something a little different than what we see in years that are less profitable, when we have tighter margins. So when we look at our most profitable years, which are years when our net returns averaged over $400 per acre for corn, we see that those were the years 2018, 2020, 2021, and 2022. And when we lay those nitrogen timing net returns at different timing classes on top of each other, they're just stacked right on top of each other. In years that are very profitable, the timing of the application isn't as important as getting the rate right, for instance. It just isn't that critical. But in years when we have these tight margins, we actually start to see some separation. I kept the scales here the same, but if you were to expand this to look at, just up to say $550 per acre net return, you see a lot of separation. And what we're seeing is that the 50-50 pre-plant and side dress and the mostly pre-plant nitrogen timing applications are the most profitable. And it seems to be more important in these years when we classically would think of it as not being a good environment, a good financial environment for farmers. So in years like 2025 is shaping up to be, applying nitrogen more in season is a good strategy. In lean years, in-season nitrogen application is more profitable. So this is just really saying that same thing, moving towards in-season application during tight margin years. Now, thinking about, we just talked about reducing our direct costs, the biggest one being nitrogen fertilizer application. Let's think now about reducing power costs. It's really the farmers who are the high efficiency farmers, the low cost farmers are the ones who are going to be rewarded in this more challenging environment that we see for finances in the farming community. So thinking about power costs, anything you can do to combine trips across the field, to combine passes, that is a good strategy. They also see some interesting things here with looking at our tillage. The tillage itself, whether we're using no-till, strip till for corn production, one-pass light, two-pass light. So one-pass light means one pass with a light tillage implement. That would be like a harrow or a spring tooth harrow or a vertical till kind of implement. But our two-pass light means two passes with that type of a vertical till, turbo till type of an implement. Very light soil disturbance, usually has moves pretty quickly, and it's just lighter weight. Two-pass moderate would be one pass with a lighter tillage implement and then one pass with something heavier, something like a chisel plow. And then 2+ tillage passes is anything that is 3 tillage passes or more with any type of an implement is what we're looking at. So we are seeing different stories here when we're looking at corn with high SPR, corn with lower SPR, and then some of our soybean. So I'm going to quickly go through that. We see all of our different cost elements here. We see that farmers are paying a minimum of $11 per acre for tillage here. So anything you can do to eliminate tillage passes is obviously saving you money. And what we're showing here is that the operator and land return on high SPR cornfields is very close, but the one-pass light and two-pass light, pretty much every year, consistently, we see that these are the two most profitable tillage strategies. One-pass light and two-pass light are the most profitable tillage strategies for higher productivity soils for corn production. Now, when we look at our lower productivity soils for corn production, we have the same setup here. We go across, we look at our operator and land return. We see this big difference for tillage for two-pass light relative to even the next highest level. It's like a $27 up to like even a $38 per acre difference on our lower SPR soils. That's such a big difference for corn production that we believe that this two-pass light, it's not going to get anybody any kind of conservation payment or award, but it does appear to be the most profitable. We're going to keep our eye on this and keep gathering this data. We don't have as many years of data on our lower SPR soils in the PCM data set. So we're continuing to watch this. And then finally, for our soybean, lower SPR soils, we do see an interesting and more nuanced story for soybean, especially on our lower SPR fields here. Have the same setup, all of our different tillage classes here. And we just have so many fields that are no-till relative to any of the other tillage strategies here. We just thought these farmers have to be doing something right. And we looked at it more closely. And what we're seeing, the story that this is telling us, remember, these are big average values, and there's a lot of numbers on either side of this $369 per acre for no-till. What we believe is happening here is that for these farmers on lower SPR fields who are consistently able to make 63 or 64 bushels per acre, those farmers can use no-till and can be confident that it's going to be a profitable strategy for them. If you're in that 61 or 62 bushel per acre class, you're right on the fence, and probably anything lower than about 60 bushel per acre, maybe think about some light tillage to move yourself into one of these more profitable classes for operator and land return. And then the last thing I'll say here, we have been talking about reducing costs. What about reducing risks? We think that that cover crops are a great strategy. It's a great conservation practice. It's excellent for reducing soil loss, for improving water quality, reducing nutrient losses, addressing climate change issues. We know all of that. It certainly is. However, if you're new to cover crops, this may not be the best environment to be trying cover crops, according to what we're seeing in our data set. Unless you're able to do it with some kind of a financial incentive. None of the data that you're seeing here in any of these slides has shown any kind of a conservation incentive payment. So if you are able to get a conservation incentive payment, maybe start small with cover crops. And certainly, if you're thinking about moving from a more tillage passes to, say, a no-till, you can absolutely overcome any of the yield penalties. You're likely to overcome those yield penalties with some of these payments that farmers are able to receive for using some of these conservation payments, either through NRCS or some of the private programs that we'll talk about a little bit later. So with that, I'm going to turn our presentation back to Sarah.
Thank you, Laura. Now I want to switch back to talk about our third study that we did that ties directly into what Laura was just talking about. So as I mentioned before, on all of our studies, we clean the data. So that means we filter out some of the observations so we make sure that we can have as much statistical power as possible when we're running the models. So we filter it for conventional non-manured soybean fields. And again, the data in the study goes through 2022. And it represents 370 farmers, 3,074 fields, and 5,292 field observations. So what this shows is we're observing those fields over the period of years. So we're observing a lot of the same fields over and over again. So it's eight years, but a lot of times, since we're just looking at the soybeans, a lot of our fields are on a corn-soybean rotation. So we're just observing that field every other year. So mostly technically 4 years of observation, but sometimes in the data we get 5. And what we wanted to answer is, how do tillage and cover crops affect yield and profit? So I know on the previous 2 studies we couldn't say a lot about directly if the MRTN was causing or the cause and effect, but on this study, since we're looking at the same fields over time, and we're controlling for that in our model. We're controlling for all the weather effects in our model, all the application effects in our model. So in this study, we can say the direct effect of tillage and cover crops on yield and on profit on our soybean fields for this time period. So this is probably my favorite study, and I find these results really interesting and hopefully very useful for our Illinois farmers. I also want to mention that we divide the data into different benchmarks. So each field is classified into a benchmark based on tillage. So we group together no-till, strip-till, 1 pass of tillage, 2 passes of tillage, and 3 or more passes of tillage. So I know in the PCM data that's published, we usually break it out a little bit more, but when I did the data analysis, I grouped some of those together based on 1, 2, or 3 passes of tillage, just to make sure we have enough observations in each of these categories to be able to run the model. And then for each field, we also classify it as either cover crops or no cover crops. And as before, I'm going to skip over all the kind of statistical and model part, but if anybody would like a copy of this paper, we'd be happy to share it with you and talk about that more in depth. But overall, our results are that no-till systems reduce soybean yields by 1 bushel per acre, but we did not find any evidence that they reduce profit. The only tillage system that statistically reduced profit in our data set was 3 or more passes of tillage. So they are $27 an acre less profitable than a 1-pass tillage system when you control for all the factors like weather and different applications. So we can find that direct effect. So 3 or more passes of tillage is consistently less profitable. We also find that over this period, and remember, this is 8 years, but usually we're only observing the field every other year, so probably 4 years, 5 max. So it's not long-term, but it's not short-term either. I would call it more medium-term. In the medium term, cover crops, we did not find any statistically different yields between cover crop and no cover crop fields. So over that time period, we were not able to find a yield effect from using cover crops. When we looked at the effect on profit, we did find that cover crops decreased profit by $40 per acre. When we're seeing, if we're not seeing that statistically different yield effect from cover crops, and we're seeing higher costs from paying for the cover crop seeds and the cover crop planting costs, then it's difficult to see a profit increase if we're not seeing a yield increase to help cover some of those additional costs from our cover crops. So our main really practical takeaways from this are that farmers, we find statistically a lot of our tillage systems result in similar or the same profits, except for the 3 or more passes of tillage, which is consistently unprofitable in our data set. And we do find some evidence of profit reduction from cover crops if there's not a yield bump to offset some of those additional costs we incur from planting cover crops. So now I'll turn it back over to Laura to talk about how you can find additional revenue streams for your fields.
Thanks a lot. So we have a couple of different strategies that farmers can use for years like this when in a downturn farm economy. There's just some good strategies. Dr. Gary Schnicke actually has a farmdoc article that came out last October the 8th, if you want to read more about that. But some of those strategies are, you can't market your way out of low returns for an extended period of time. During these low return periods, and when it's not well known that they're going to come to an end soon, don't try to market your way out of it. Don't think you can. You need to be a low-cost producer. That's really the number one safest strategy, and it's really the go-to strategy. But another recommendation is to take every payment that's available, and that would include government payments as well as some of these private payments. And PCM Precision Conservation Management offers our farmers a number of different types of payments through our partners. Some of those are federal and some of them are private. Some of our farmers do not want to be involved in a government program. They don't care for all the paperwork or different aspects of it. Other farmers are very tolerant of the government programs or are less likely to be in a private program. But we believe we have something for all of the farmers that we work with if they're making some of these practice changes. We even provide these payments because we have wonderful partners who understand this. Our private partners like PepsiCo and the Kentucky Distillers Association reward farmers in our program who have been doing these practices for a long time. So even if you're a long-term no-tiller, a long-term cover crop farmer or strip tiller, you can receive some of these payments. So this is a time to look into that. If you are using these payments, you're someone who's been doing this for a while or thinking about doing it this year, reach out to us. We can help you. There are funds anywhere from $5 an acre to $60 per acre through PCM and our different partners. Two of the ones that we work with, in addition to PepsiCo and the Kentucky Distillers that I mentioned, are Field to Market has one of these climate smart Commodities Programs Awards, and there's the Farmers for Soil Health, which is another Climate Smart Commodities program. So these are options for farmers, and just a way to help offset some of the risk and the extra costs that our farmers are seeing when they are adopting these practices that we know are great for water quality and soil erosion and climate. And stack some of these programs, but it can be complicated, and we suggest that you speak to someone about how you're doing this to be sure that you're not violating any of the basic rules or the contracts. Some of the basics here: if you are receiving federal funding, like through any of the Climate Smart programs, you cannot be enrolled in 2 Climate Smart programs at the same time. If you're getting funding through, say, EQIP or CSP through your NRCS office, you cannot be paid twice for the same practice on the same acre. And of course, your NRCS staff is happy to talk through that and be sure that you're meeting all those requirements. And for these private programs, whether it is what they call a Scope 3 type of program or a Scope 1, whether it's an actual carbon market or a private program, you cannot sell a carbon asset that you're developing and you're receiving a payment for twice from the same acre, no matter what that practice is. So that's something to be careful about. Work with the people that are selling you those credits. Be sure that you're not violating any of those programs, because a lot of them are being audited. And if you are interested in PCM, we are here for you. We would love to work with you on your farm. We also are happy to provide different kinds of programming and educational opportunities if you're hosting an event. So reach out to us. For farmers, we are here to help you understand your farm financials. Every conservation practice is a business decision for you farmers, and we don't want any farmer to become so green that they put themselves out of business. That's terrible for all of us. We're like literally getting rid of our very best farmers when something like that happens, and we see that as just a really terrible thing. So we want to make sure every farmer who's using these conservation practices is doing it profitably. So work with us and help us to help you. This service is free to farmers in our regions. Actually, we pay you for the first 2 years in the program. After we benchmark your operation, we can also help to find conservation funding through our different partners and other programs out there. We just want to help you to get the best program for you. If it's not through PCM, that's quite all right. We just want to find the best fit for you. And then PCM specialists are here to help you understand all the different options that are available to you. We work in Illinois and Kentucky and Nebraska, and we look forward to working with you. And even with different things that are out there in the economy, it's a challenge. There are programs that are out there to help you, and you should take advantage of those. It's hard. Farming's hard. Farmers have a statistically higher rate of suicide than the general population. And we all know that farmers incur risk. They bear it every year. Even good years can be challenging. Bad years can be devastating to farmers individually and their families and their communities. Please, if you need some help, reach out. There's some great services. These 2 QR codes here are links to help you find a different kind of mental health services, just someone you can talk to. And there's the Farm SOS hotline down there too. If you ever need somebody to talk to, reach out, because someday somebody will need you. And we thought, since we have a lot of heavy things to talk about, downturned economy, uncertainty, and a lot of other things that are going on in the world today, we'd like to end on something that we're all positive about. This was my version of what we're optimistic about. So I put into AI, I said, create this image for me. This is what I think of when I think of happy things. And apparently this is what Jim Baltz thinks about when he thinks about what makes farmers happy. If you look really closely, you can actually see dollar bills embedded in the grain falling out of the combine there. So that's pretty funny. I don't know if that's what all of you are resonating with right now, but if it is, I thought Sarah and I would take a minute and talk about the things that make us happy. I'll go first. I have three things. I think that moments like this, challenging as they are, one silver lining is that hopefully the very best programs out there are going to become stronger, and some of the programs that aren't as good, that are honestly sort of just static in the message, are not going to make it. They're going to go away. And overall, I think that is probably not a bad thing for farmers, because at this moment and for the past several years, farmers have been inundated with different kinds of conservation program options. And sometimes there was just some paralysis involved in all the different options. So at this moment, I'd like to see the best programs that are really there to serve our farmers standing out and being highlighted, and hopefully coming together to play to everybody's strengths and offering farmers some really great options for increasing their conservation acres. A second thing that I think is pretty great about years like this is that farmers are learning just how lean they can really be, and they might be pleasantly surprised to learn that some things that they think they've been investing in and year out, actually they're doing fine without some of those things, or at least that they might not need them as in at the rate that they're using, or every year. And finally, I think that the last thing that I'll say that can be good about a year like 2024 and 2025 is that we really are going to have to shift our mindset and move more towards profitability over this high yield mindset. I think that's a good thing for farmers, for the farm economy, for supply and demand, and I think it's great for water quality and soil health. Okay, that's mine. Sarah, what are you feeling optimistic about?
Thank you, Laura. I know it's hard. It's hard to be an ag economist during these times of tighter margins and kind of sharing this message. And I know it's even harder being a farmer trying to weather these difficult financial times. So when I was leaving campus yesterday here at South Dakota State University, I saw some daffodils blooming outside one of our buildings. I had to stop and take a picture, because for me, this was the first sign of the hope of spring coming, and we've almost made it through the long winter here in South Dakota. So even though it looks like a snow globe outside my office window right now, and we have a winter weather warning until the end of the day, I think about the flowers I saw yesterday, and I'm optimistic about the promise of spring coming. And in the same way, I'm optimistic of farmers' ability to weather these difficult financial times during times of tighter farm margins. I know it's challenging, but just like the promise of spring, I know that this is a cycle, and that our farmers are going to weather the storm and emerge on the other side, and that we and a lot of other people are here to help farmers do that. So good times will return, and this too shall pass.
That's great.
If I can jump in, I have one, and this is actually something that I'm really very optimistic about, and that makes me happy both. I am really optimistic that Emerson, and happy that Emerson Nafziger and the rest of the crew in crop sciences has done so much work on nitrogen rates, more than any of the other states. I'm hopeful that they will catch up, that the MRTN, when it pops these numbers out, as you've already seen in the data that Laura and Sarah have shown you, those rates are really good and really accurate. There are many, many more years of data from the University of Illinois in those MRTN rates than from other land grants. So I'm really happy about that. Optimistic that it will continue to be that way, and that the data will come in. And so happy, I think, particularly that the corn growers and the soybean association have been a big part of PCM, along with Gary Schnitke and Sarah and the rest of them, working to make this work really, really well. Let's talk a little bit about our sponsors at this point. Thinking of the corn growers and the soybean associations, our sponsors do include the TIA Center for Farmland Research, CoBank, Compere Financial, Corteva, Farm Credit Illinois, Growmark, the Illinois Corn Growers Association, and the Illinois Soybean Association. Our FarmDoc educational partners are the College of Agricultural, Consumer, and Environmental Sciences, the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics, U of I Extension, FBFM, the Gardener Policy Program here on campus as well. Don't forget that you can always find us at farmdocdaily.illinois.edu. And if I could have Sarah turn on her video camera, we'll answer a few of the rest of the questions that have been written and are online. I think you probably have some of them in front of you, Laura. What do you want to take up first?
Let's see. There was the question about, it looks as if the total equipment costs are pretty comparable when folks made 2 or even 3 trips across the field. And how can that be? Let me see if I can jump back here to that. I think that actually, bear with me here. Sorry. So let's see. So there's what's called field work and there's what's called power costs. And these, so the field work is just tillage, tillage passes, and obviously the different tillage classes have very, very different costs here. And they do reflect the different type of implement, the power, the fuel, all of that is rolled up into this field work cost, and field work really is code for tillage. And then it is interesting that the power costs can often be quite similar. But that includes different kinds of passes across the field with different kinds of equipment. Of course, it's planting and harvesting and the tillage, but it can also be if farmers are using more herbicide passes across the field, then that would be reflected in additional power costs for the sprayer and any other kind of pass across the field. So it does appear that farmers who do more tillage might be dialing back on some of their passes for herbicides. Farmers who are doing no-till or less tillage might be using more of that. It seems like there is overall a balance, and I think that's really what we're seeing here.
On my screen, I got rid of this question, but if I remember correctly, it also asked about the labor cost and whether that was included. And Sarah, since you worked with Gary Schnitke on this, you probably know, but my guess is that they are using custom numbers, which would include the labor and the machinery costs both. So they're custom farming numbers. Is that? And I don't know whether that's actually correct or not. Can you confirm that?
I'm not sure, but it's usually my understanding is that the data to construct these came from the Illinois Machinery Cost Report and data from FBFM. So
yeah,
it would make sense that there was a management
cost then. Yeah, it should. I'm going to go. I can't imagine that Gary did not do it that way, and that the rest of the ag economists didn't. So we'll go with that one. There is another question wanting to know if there is a direction. When you showed the slide that had 68% of the growers in excess of the MRTN. Is that changing over time, and what's the trend?
I can address that because that was a great question. Yes, we are. We're seeing that even farmers over time, and of course, remember that from the time that we started collecting data in 2015, and then until just recent years, those 2021 and 2022 nitrogen fertilizer prices or 2022 and 2023 were really very high. We did see that the overall average in that MRTN class of over the MRTN, that even though it was over, it became less over in those high nitrogen fertilizer cost years, or perhaps it's just because PCM has been very effective at helping farmers to see that they don't need to apply those very high rates, whatever. But we do see that that class, just like Dr. McIsaac was asking, the application rate in that high or the above MRTN class, it is over time going down. So it's over, but it becomes less over the MRTN over time.
And Laura, if you could bring the last slide up, I'll wrap ourselves up. Thank you, Sarah Sellars, for being with us. It's awfully good to see you again. I hope you're enjoying your time there at South Dakota State. I am sorry, however, that you're still snowbound there because the flowers have been out here for a while and we may need to mow our yards. I was walking the neighborhood and I know at least one person that has. It's not me at this point. Grass is green here. And Laura Gentry, we thank you for being with us as well. One more. Slide to the very end. We do want you to visit our website, farmdocdaily.illinois.edu. And you can always find this webinar again in the archives there. Look under the archive section under webinars and events. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm University of Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason on behalf of Jen Baltz, who's behind the scenes and making things go so very well. Wishing you a good afternoon.